Mediocre leadership is no longer adequate for survival as an industry. We don't have the quality of leadership we need in our newsrooms today to survive the challenges we've got coming our way through technological changes.
I think we're going into a completely different world now. Jeremy Clifford has spent 35 years leading inside Newsroom as a reporter, editor, and newsroom leader. Today, he works with editors and leadership teams, navigating digital transformation and constant change.
Leaders of previous decades could get away with being the expert in everything. Today they can't. A difficult conversation is one that you'd rather not have with someone. Be 100% clear on what the outcome of that conversation has to be. You need to have data or you need to have example. You've got to be prepared to listen. It's okay not to have all the answers.
Jeremy, what is it that you know through your whole time working with leadership in Newsroom that would make the time for the listeners to stay throughout the whole conversation?
What I would say is that we don't have the quality of leadership we need in our newsrooms today to survive the challenges we've got coming our way through technological changes. Mediocre leadership is no longer adequate for survival as an industry. And unless we address that, then we're not going to survive in the way that we envisage that we want to do by thriving and engaging with our audiences.
I think we're going into a completely different world now where we've been moving away from maybe reach, big traffic numbers. We're getting more into focus on the audience. And one of the things that I'm sure we're going to be touching on is AI changing the whole game. But for the listeners, who are you, Jeremy? And what is your background in the newsroom? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I've got about 35 years background working in newsrooms, both as reporter and as editor. So I've edited 4 of our regional titles, but in the UK. But latterly, I was then took on the role as the editor-in-chief of the 3rd biggest media organisation in the UK. And my job there was about helping to create strategies, help the digital transformation, help that change that we've got from print to digital and get people into that digital first mentality. And as a result of that, and working with people for many, many years, a lot of my work was about helping them to adapt to change, be better leaders and bring leadership teams together. So then I left that job and I've now gone full-time as a qualified leadership coach. And what I do now is I work in newsrooms helping to develop that pipeline of talent and also to help people with that never-ending rhythm of change which we're facing in our industry.
I think we're seeing more change now than ever, and I'm really been looking forward for this conversation, especially on the topic about leadership in the newsroom. And if you, Jeremy, were to look at the newsrooms today, where do you think really leadership most often breaks down, and where does it quietly make the biggest difference today?
Yeah, good question, Nils. I think it breaks down today where we promote people into leadership positions and we think they can do the job, but we don't give them the skills, we don't give them the knowledge to deal with and the confidence to deal with possibly the most difficult part of being in a newsroom, and that is with people. And people's demands and the way they adapt to change, and some people who resist to change. And so we don't give them those skills and the competencies to deal with those challenges. And, you know, I think one of the biggest differences today is that leaders of previous decades could get away with being the expert in everything. Today they can't. You know, there's no way they can be expected to understand how video works, how social works, how algorithms work, and that sort of thing. And so therefore, and yet we don't tell leaders that it's okay not to know those answers.
What you said just resonated quite heavily with me. It's I can remember from not in a newsroom, but being promoted early into a leadership role. Maybe one of the things that I was more looking forward to, this was going to be a career change for me, finding out I'm a terrible leader and I'm not able to cope with all of these things, and like how like building these things around me that maybe would make me cope. But do you have like examples of like how you build something around somebody who would be in that situation I was, and like what are the things to, if you're in that situation feeling okay, this is too early, too difficult, how can you help somebody like that?
Well, what I do, absolutely, what I do is that I sit down with those leaders and we diagnose where they're weak and where they're strong. And I use a diagnostic tool. And it looks at certain competencies which we tailor to each individual and where they are in industry. But we then look at things like, so how good are you at prioritization? How good are you making difficult decisions or having difficult conversations with people? How good are you building relationships with people, not only within editorial, but as a leader across the whole of the newsroom? And we diagnose that and say, okay, well, look, if you're at this level, what level do you want to be at? And so therefore, what training, what coaching do you need to have to be able to progress in that career? And that's something which we just don't do at that level of leadership.
I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that, in terms of leadership, which I think is an interesting topic, is sort of like tone and presence that you have as a leader. And if we were to go like really practical in this case, like when leadership tone is off in the newsroom or elsewhere, like what does that sort of feel like and look like with the feedback you're getting from editors and journalists when the leadership tone is off? What's the feeling like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think what you see is that you have a disengaged newsroom. So if the leadership isn't on the message and isn't engaging with the newsroom, then the reporters and the journalists, the content creators know this, um, and so therefore the passion goes out of the newsroom. So what you have is you have a almost like a mechanical process of creating stories and publishing stories, rather than people actually, being aligned with the vision of the leader. And the other part to it is when the leadership tone is off, is that if you have a conflicting message, so if you have the message from the business hierarchy that this is the direction we're going in, this is our strategy, and the editor isn't communicating that strategy, he's actually ploughing his own route that he wants to go in, then the newsroom will see that and they'll be confused. So the two things really, I think, Nils, is what you see is, one, you see a disengaged newsroom, which means you get a mechanical process to content creation. And two, you get confusion because you've got conflicting messages.
Well, if we then move to doing this right, then when the tone is right, is that then where I think you're going with it? Is you're clear on the direction and everybody is able to articulate this is where we feel it going, and everybody is able to articulate that direction. Is that the right tone then?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You need alignment, don't you? And if you've got a vision, you've got to be able to communicate that in a way where people believe in it as well. So that's the other thing that you need to be careful of, is that you are delivering a strategy that people know can be delivered and is going to make a difference. So, for example, I've worked in newsrooms before where the chief executive will be going on about, the this is how we're going to get to growth, and yet he's then talking about how they're going to cut parts of the newsroom. And so the journalists then say, well, how are we going to get to growth if you're still cutting back on our workforce? And so you've got to have an alignment that where the journalists actually believe in that vision and believe, that their role in that is actually going to deliver the strategy as well. If you don't get that, then you're going to have the problems we've just talked about, which is that disengagement.
How often do you need to do this? Is this like having like a tone hole every single quarter, re-emphasizing this? Like one example I keep on thinking about, which I just think is genius, and I think I'm interested in if you have example of this, is VG in Norway have this thing called 10:45 that is done at 10:45 where they have a very short time, I think it's 50 minutes or something, where the editor-in-chief goes through what's happening in the news image at the moment, what are the good things that they've been doing, what didn't they achieve correctly. And it's just 50 minutes. Like, what I'm looking for is like, how do you need to have like a tunnel each quarter re-emphasizing this, or how can you make this into small gatherings? Do you have examples for yourself as an editor-in-chief, how you've done this in a easy, short way? Is it meetings after meetings, re-emphasizing? Do you have examples of this?
Yeah, I mean, now look, we're talking about communication, right? And part of great leadership is getting that communication right. If you just had town halls every quarter, then that's not going to do it, because people are going to forget it. So you've got to have a number of different communication strategies. So as an example, what I did was that I love the idea of the 10:45. I used to have a 3 p.m. And I did it once a week on a Friday afternoon. And I used to bring my newsroom to a halt. And for half an hour, we went through what had happened during the week, what the great stories that worked were, why they worked, and also we then I then singled out people who'd done some really good work and actually said, "Oh, this story really worked because of X, Y, and Z." And as a result of it, during that week as well, I gave them some detail about how we were performing as a company. So had we hit our targets? So going back to believing in the strategy and people knowing what they need to do, you've got to constantly remind people in this ever-changing world that we've got that this is our strategy and this is how we're delivering it. So that's a weekly thing. I do think you do have to have town halls, but if you can't rely on that as the only method of communication. So, and the other thing which I've seen other editors do is that they will send out a weekly email. In fact, Reach now I think they do it daily. Reach Media over in the UK, they send out these are the best stories which have worked this week across the whole of the group. And so it's just having different communication mechanisms and different styles to constantly reinforce that message of what you're trying to achieve.
And if you're coming in as a newsroom leader, talking a little bit about like the influence, maybe not authority here, is like newsrooms are full of really strong opinionated people with really deep expertise. Like, how does a leader earn influence in that kind of environment? And going in, you mentioned like not having answers to everything as one of the things in the beginning, but like, how do you go into those newsroom and create influence?
Yeah, yeah. I have this question asked of me so many times when I do my leadership training as well, because what you get is, you get some people who are promoted upwards within the industry and within their newsroom, and one of their biggest challenges they have is then, well, how do I tell someone who used to be one of my peers and one of my colleagues what they now need to do? Or how do I tell people who've got far more experience in the newsroom what they need to be doing as well? So there's a whole confidence thing and authority. So what do you need to do? Well, you've got to be a really good listener. If you're just going into the newsroom and you're not prepared to listen, then you're not going to bring the newsroom with you, because they're going to judge you on what you do rather than what you're prepared to listen and hear what you've got. So going back to that idea that from an editor's point of view, that they can't be expected to know everything. So to build authority and build respect, you've got to go in and you've got to have some vulnerability about yourself and to say, look, I haven't got the answers to everything. I don't know the way that everything works. And so therefore, I'm going to build a team around me of experts. And then they need to be comfortable that these experts will know more about certain parts of the business than they do. And I liken it to driving a car. So if if I've got a car, personally, I'm not a mechanic and I have got no interest and I don't know how the car actually works. But I don't need to know how it works. What I do need to do is I need to know where I want to drive it and the direction I want to drive it in. And as a leader, if you're comfortable saying, okay, well, look, this is where we're going and setting the strategy, and my team around me, I'm prepared to listen to you about how we're going to do that and what levers we need to pull. That's the way you're going to build authority and respect, rather than going in and saying, I know everything and I'm not prepared to listen to you. Does that make sense?
It makes absolutely sense, and I'm having another question that comes from there, which I if you look at some of, for example, C leadership or the newsroom leadership team, if I'm a leader there and I'm picking people around me to then go for that strategy, what do I need to like pick the right members that is making me shine as a leader? Like, what's the process? How do you pick a team?
Yeah, and if we take from theory to practice, let's deal with the practical side of it. You're not going to get it right all the time. You're going to get people who just aren't going to perform. So, let's take a football analogy. You may well sign someone in your team because they were really good playing for another team, but you put them into your team, and they might not suit the tactics that you've got. I'm a Liverpool fan, and we're looking at how Florian Wirtz has been struggling in his new role in the team. He's a brilliant player, and he's beginning to learn how to play the Liverpool way now, and he's beginning to have his impact. And putting that back into how you select your team that you need, your what I call your inner cabinet around you, is okay. It's a bit of trial and error. It's a bit of trust, but there's a thing I have this thing called it's the trust triangle. And what I talk about there is that, you need to look at the people and the capabilities that they've got. And not everyone's going to be a perfect fit. And so, you then say, okay, well, has this person got 70% of what I need? And therefore, can I build their capabilities to be the 100% of the person that I need? And what I see with leadership teams in some newsrooms is that they 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 don't spend enough time trying to develop the people within the team. And so what that happens is that they then don't trust the person to do the job. And because they don't trust the person to do the job, their job then becomes overloaded because they're doing that other person's work. And so you have a capacity issue. So to my mind, what you have to do is you have to identify the people. You've got to identify where they're strong and where they need to develop, and then you invest time helping them to develop. If they don't develop, you as a leader are going to have to do more work, and you're going to have capacity issues. So how do you then decide? How do you pick those people? Well, you do it over time. You can't just immediately create a team. You have to look at what they're good at. But also going back to this idea of being a listening person, is that you've got to spend an awful lot of time as a new leader being prepared to listen to people, to hear them, to ask um, curious questions. Be a curious person and see, what they're interested in. Have they got the right mentality? Have they got the right attitude? Are they willing to learn? And all those sorts of things go into your decision as to how you create the team around you. We haven't talked about expertise. Of course, that's really important as well. So they've got to have the basics. They've got to know, they've got to have the basic expertise in the areas that you want them to do. But also, it's also not only the skill, but the will to be able to learn as well.
Coming into what you're saying here is also like having this conversation about learning and improving, but then also we're coming to this part which is difficult also. The difficult conversation is also part of the newsroom life, is that you being able to learn and improve, but then these conversation about performance and behavior often feel so tense, and I'm one of the person that can become very defensive about it and difficult. But then how do you have this sort of conversation about performance and behavior without it? Is it possible to have it without feeling tense and going in defense?
Oh my God, that's such a difficult thing to do as a leader, right? And once again, this is a question I'm asked so many times about. So how do I, correct someone's behavior, or how do I change what they do, or how do I pull them up when they've done something wrong? And well, let's answer that question. Is it always going to be tense? Yeah, it is. Yeah. So, when I talk to people, I ask them questions about what to you is a difficult conversation. So to you, Nils, if I'm going to ask you the question, so, give me some examples of what a difficult conversation may be. What are the sorts of things that come to your mind?
For me, it can be that if I maybe have colleagues doing something in a specific way where I would think that there's a different way to do it, something that I should maybe recommend them. And I might say it and they may feel, okay, that was sort of like asking for something that is meant like an improvement, but I feel like now offended because I might have done something wrong. That's a thing that I've seen
Mm.
throughout my career is that you wish for it to be an improvement, but it can be taken as feeling like, oh, you don't think I'm doing my job, but it's meant in the best possible way. That could be an example.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a good example. I've got a really simple way of answering that question, and that is that a difficult conversation is one that you'd rather not have with someone.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so therefore it can cover a multitude of things. So, it can be about someone's personal hygiene. And I've had those conversations. My God, they're not easy conversations. Um, it can be about their performance, or it could be about their attitude in meetings, all those sorts of things. So how do you go about it? I mean, it's, so I have a bit of a framework that I use on this. The first thing I do is that, before I go into that conversation, I need to be 100% clear on what the outcome of that conversation has to be. And if I'm not clear on the outcome of it, then that meeting is going to go really badly, because you're going to get distracted, you're going to get deflected by people who are going to throw all sorts of reasons for this. And so, you need to be really clear about what's the outcome that you want. The second then is you've got to prepare for that conversation. So you've got to think about how you're going to open a conversation you're going to have with someone. Because so what's your opening line going to be? And you've got to be really have some real clarity to the person. So say, Nils, I want to talk to you about your punctuality, at work, because you keep on coming to work late. Okay. So that you're being really clear on it. Um, and then what you've got is that your reaction is likely to be, well, what are you talking about? I was on time today, type of thing. And so you then need to have data. And Niels, I mean, you'll be a fan of data, and when that's your job, right? Um, so effectively, you need to have data, or you need to have examples so that you can arm yourselves with some evidence that you're going to talk to them about. And once you've got to that stage, you then need to move into, once you've agreed what you're going to be talking about, you've then got to be prepared to listen. And, this is a constant theme of what we've been talking about on this podcast already, is that as a leader, this isn't a one-way broadcast conversation. It's a conversation. So therefore, that person's going to have some things to say which you may not have thought about. And so therefore, you've got to be prepared to listen and to explore with them the reasons why that behavior is being shown. So and you've got to use your best journalistic skills. So you've got to ask really good, insightful questions and open-ended questions, and and talk to them and explore the issue. And once you've got to that and you've done the exploration, you then need to move it forward into, okay, right, so what are we going to do about it? Okay, so this is the situation. This is the reason behind it. I understand that. But knowing the outcome that you want, you need to bring it back to the outcome and say, okay, right, so I hear all that. How can we now move forward to find a solution to that? And what you're doing then is you are putting the emphasis on them to come up with some solutions. And if they say, I don't know, say, okay, well, look, what else can we explore that might help you to have an answer as to how we might get you to turn up to work on time, Nils? Yeah. And it may well be, well, maybe I need to get up a bit earlier, or maybe I need to, make sure that I get an earlier bus into work, or whatever. But you are coming up with the answers rather than me coming up with them. Because if I come up with the answers, then you're just going to walk out the room and nothing's going to change, because it's my idea and not your idea. And once you've got to the options and you've decided what you're going to do, you then need to agree what that action's going to be. And then you have a follow through to say, okay, right, that's great. Let's have a meeting in 2 weeks' time and to see how things have changed. And if you don't do that last bit, then what's going to happen is that it just won't change. And, what you're doing is you're giving permission for that behavior to carry on. So that's my 6-step framework that I use, is that, be clear on the outcome, prepare for it, have some data, be listening about it, prepared to listen and to compromise as well. Come up with some options and then agree what your next steps are going to be.
It's so interesting when you say it because I heard, or even in my own career, I've been different versions of that where you're missing some parts and not, for example, the listening part, or you go directly to what the issue is. And I think maybe one of the things that you said, which makes sense for me, is that you need to have an outcome already thought through of what you want from it, because if you don't have it, does it really change?
No, it doesn't. And if also the other thing is that if you don't have the outcome, then are you really committed to having that conversation and to changing that behavior? So there's got to be something which is worth you going through that process of having a difficult conversation. There's nothing I can say that's going to make you make that conversation less tense and difficult. But there are things I can say that's going to say that, that's convince you it's the right way to have the conversation and how to effectively, still keep people motivated, having come out of that meeting with you, and actually they've come up with ideas that they're going to change. So that's the thing about it, is that what you don't want to have is a one-way broadcast. You're just talking at them, they leave, and nothing's really changed, or you haven't changed your attitude. Your job as a journalist, or as a leader, is to try to get people to engage in the conversation and come up with solutions that you both agree on. And it may well be that we say, okay, well, look, maybe, there'll be 1 or 2 days a week when, I may still be late for work because of X, Y, and Z. But the other 3 days, I can make that time. And that's at least a starting position. So be prepared to compromise is always a thing to bear in mind as well. There's a guy I follow called Michael Anderson. He's an American. And he says this about preparing your right line in your conversation. And he says that, there's the only part of the conversation you are ever in control of is the first 15 seconds.
Hmm.
Because then I've got no idea how you might respond to me. And so therefore practice that first 15-second opening, so that you've got a form of words that you're going to use, and that, you're in control of that part of the meeting. The rest of it, you've got no idea what's going to happen.
So this will be a first in the podcast, but I want to put you to the test then, and almost for the listeners to feel how this would be. I have a little bit of a scenario in mind that I see a lot in Newsroom. You said that I like data and numbers. Oh yes, I do. And one of the things that I very often see is in the direction of the Newsroom now, and you are of course an expert on, for example, the implementing of user needs in the Newsroom. And there's been leadership gone along that we are going to be really much better at understanding our audience, and we're implementing user needs. Imagine for a second, listeners and Jeremy, that I'm one of the journalists. I hate this idea. I like writing breaking news only, and I don't really want to implement it. I have analytics that is now showing like what we're performing on in terms of the different user needs. And I'm simply not wanting to change in that case, and I'm one of those that you need to have a conversation about going that direction. So let's say that you invite me for that meeting. I'm the journalist. Like, here's your 15 seconds, Jeremy.
Right. Thanks, Nils. Okay. So what I would say, I would open that conversation and say, Nils, I'd like to talk to you today about the new strategy we're putting in place about user needs. I've noticed that in our meetings that we've had so far, you're not responding very well to this. Can you tell me why that might be?
Yeah, I really think that I know my audience really well, and breaking is the one thing that I've always been doing. I'm good at that. I keep into the formats. And you guys in leadership keeps on throwing these new things at us. There's too much change, and I look at the numbers. They are great. I get lots of page views on the breaking story, so I don't really see the value in it.
Well, that may be true. And, I think you're doing a great job in breaking news stories. And, I've looked at your numbers and they're really strong. However, we as an organization, we're not just about breaking news. We want to go deeper into some of our stories because we're now moving to a subscription model, and we want our readers to engage more deeply with us. So when I've looked at some of your stories which aren't breaking news, and I've looked at the numbers, they're not performing as well as some other people in the newsroom. So I wondered whether you could tell me why that might be.
Well, I kept on stick to what I'm good at. It's the breaking. That's what I like to write about. And come on, my numbers are great on it. So why are you looking at other numbers which I'm not focusing on at the moment?
Well, and that's because, as I've said to you, that as a strategy, we're moving into user needs because we still want the breaking news. So don't get me wrong, we still are going to be a breaking news organization, but because of our strategy is moving towards a deeper engagement with our readers, and we want them to subscribe to us, we have to also provide a different type of story, and so therefore maybe there's some help and training that we could work on together to help you to develop new skills to be even better at delivering the strategy for the business.
I
How do
guess
you
you have
feel
some
about that?
point. I guess you have some points there. I could maybe be doing more, but what could that be? Like, what can you help me with?
Well, what ideas have you got?
Uh, maybe is work with the other journalists that are doing well on this and learn from them. Could be one of the things.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And is there anything else that comes to mind?
Maybe changing my attitude.
Okay. Um, and what part of the attitude are you seeing that may be holding you back from wanting to do this?
It's maybe alignment with the direction on this, but you mentioned it a couple of times why we're doing it, so it makes sense to do it. So I'll be more open to the idea.
Okay. And maybe we can give you some support. So we could put in some extra training sessions about the user needs, so that you can understand a bit more, and you can contribute your ideas to how we could take it forward. How does that sound to you?
I think that could be a good way to do it.
Okay. Well, look, why don't we give that a go, and why don't we come back in a week's time and discuss some of the ideas and put a plan together? How does that
Mm,
sound?
sounds good. Now this is the sort of conversation I think is you went through all of the different steps there, but if I were to in that role play, I became sort of a little bit defensive, and then I went to sort of I acknowledge maybe my attitude or so. If I would have been going, no, don't believe in it, and so on, you almost come to like what do you do when somebody don't want to change and they move forward, and are you then directly to okay, then we have to fire? Like, what do you do if it's not getting anywhere?
Well, yeah, and this is all very well in theory, but we are dealing with real people, and sometimes you are going to get to a stage where people just don't want to change. So what I always recommend is that you try different techniques. You say, okay, well, look, this is where we want to go with the strategy, and tell me why you don't believe in the strategy. Tell me what it is about the strategy you don't believe in. Then you explore to them, okay, well, you know, are there, how would you change the strategy if you were me? What would you do? And they're going to come up with things which just aren't practical. They're bound to. And so you say, well, look, this is what I've heard your views. This is the direction we're going in. I'd like you to go away and think about how you might change what you do. If they then, and so you adjourn your meeting effectively to say, okay, well, look, we've taken it as far as we can today. Let's come back to this tomorrow or next week and discuss it some more. And if they are persistent in not changing their attitude, then quite clearly having a difficult conversation is going to escalate into a more formal conversation you're going to have. And some people, you are just not going to change. And so you will get into a disciplinary type of that, and you'll escalate it in a different way, because not every conversation is going to turn a sinner into a saint, if you like. But my belief is that there are, you know, if you give people enough evidence and reasoning about it, they will change the way they want to work because they want to be successful. All journalists want to have their copy read, right? Or they want to see it seen. They want to see it, appearing high enough on the homepage and those sorts of things. And so therefore, you're giving them tools to do that. If quite simply they don't want to learn and they don't want to listen, then at some point you do have to give up on them.
Hmm. I One of the things that I think comes through here also with leadership is this being able to show empathy. And On the part that I just asked about, there's more pressure than ever in the industry for in the newsroom, and there's also a lot of job insecurity. I think reading on Press Gazette, reading here in the Nordics, and so there's a lot of uncertainty about the journalist jobs now and job cuts. How does that context change what people need from leadership when we have these insecurity and then also now with a lot of the restructuring and how the leadership should be in that context?
Yeah. Can I answer that in a slightly different way? And that is not, uh, let's not do first what people need from leadership, but how leadership needs to change in these sorts of circumstances. And I think the one thing that I've seen, having had to deliver job cuts too many times in my career, and also now helping people through that process, is for a leader, you've got to have some really core values about yourself, and some clear ways of actually delivering your message. And the first thing I think is you have to have absolute clarity about what you're saying, so that people aren't leaving that conversation confused about what you're trying to achieve or what the business is trying to achieve. They may not like that clarity, but at least they've got a choice that they understand what it is. Okay. Um, the second part of that is you need to have authenticity as a leader, and that's something I talk about an awful lot. So when I talk about the emotional intelligence of a leader, and that's what I do a lot of my training on, um, is for leader nowadays they really need to develop their softer skills that they've got, because leaders in the past very good, it's very top down, very command driven type thing. That doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. So at the outset of this conversation, we were talking about, okay, why should people listen for the next 60 minutes? It's because I think the whole idea about leadership in the past is broken, and we need a new type of leadership. And a lot of that comes down to you as an authentic leader, and you need to show some vulnerability about things as well. So you need to be prepared to admit that you haven't got all the answers. And so, if you're going through a transition or a restructure in your newsroom, it's a difficult message, and people will be asking questions of you. So you need to be brave enough to be able to say, look, I don't know the answer to that at this stage, but I'm going to go away and try to find it. Or it may well be, they may well say, is this going to be the last job cut we're ever going to have? Well, you can't say yes to that because you don't know what's going to happen next week or next month or 6 months' time. So therefore, you've got to be authentic and say, well, look, I can't answer that question. But what I can tell you is that for the time being, this is the structure we're going to put in place because we think this is the way that's going to safeguard your jobs. So not promising stuff that you can't deliver on. So there's a chief exec for one of the really big media organizations here in the UK who used to say, when a restructure was happening, is that the team that I enter the year with is the team I'm going to end the year with. Well, he just can't guarantee that. And so what people then hear from that is that there aren't going to be any more job cuts. But he didn't actually mean that. What he meant was, the team I begin the year with is the team I intend to have at the end of the year. Is he still saying there may well still be changes, but he hasn't done it in a clear way. So to my mind, you've got to have real clarity as a leader. You've got to have empathy and emotional intelligence. And you've got to have authenticity that says, look, I can't guarantee the future, but what I can tell you is with the reasons why we're doing this today.
You said there that sort of the old way of newsroom leadership is sort of broken in terms of the way it is today. And you started with saying there's a lot of change happening in the industry. And let's talk about one of the things that I think is changing a lot, which is AI. And I have the question for you, like, on that statement that you had, compared to like 10, 15 years ago, leaders, you know now more, you know more about this area than anybody, but what is it that AI is changing in terms of how things used to work with leadership that we now need to change towards?
Um, Simple answer to that is everything. Um, but it's not just AI. I don't think, Nils. I think it's how data is also changing things as well. So if you see that AI is, you know, is linked with data and technology and that sort of thing. So when I was an editor, you know, you made a decision on the good old gut instinct that you had, the gut feeling of what a good story is. Today, as a leader, God, you've got so much data coming at you, and then you've got the technology changes coming at you as well. That you know, so we go back to this idea that you know you've got to build a team who has got the expertise, because you know you can't be expected to be a data analyst, a data expert, you know, a great journalist, know how and when to use AI or whatever. So you want to build a team around you that has got that expertise, that and you know you're you want to draw on their expertise and have their input into it. But if I go into data as an example, you know, data is a good thing. It's also a bad thing, right? Because data can give you nowadays an immediate response and reaction to how your story's performing. And that's all very well and good, but you know, it's you can't you can't completely rely on that. So you've got to be able to put it into context of what's good for your brand. Okay, so it may well be that you want to cover a really important story that the data's telling you isn't the audience aren't reading, but you as a brand have to be covering that story because you know it's you know that's why some people are coming to you. So data masks a whole thing. You know, it's not just one audience. You've got hundreds of audiences in data. And just because it's not giving you the biggest number doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing that story. Let me give you an example. Um, the editor of the Liverpool Echo, um, when he was covering the Hillsborough inquiry, which was the you know the big FA Cup deaths between at Sheffield Wednesday, at Sheffield Wednesday's ground, um, 93 people died in that tragedy. And there's a big inquest and big inquiry to this. He sent his reporter along to that inquiry every single day. Now, his numbers weren't great because the BBC were also there and the BBC were getting all the audience. So did the editor then decide that he wasn't going to cover that story because the data was telling him, you know, that it wasn't resonating with the big audiences? Well, it would have been suicide for him not to cover that story in Liverpool. So, you know, data is really important to you, but also so is understanding of your brand and the importance to it as well. So you've got to, as a leader today, you've got to navigate, you know, understand data, you've got to understand AI, and you've got to understand all sorts of things. But you've also got to understand the importance of it to your brand as well.
Yeah, I wanted to almost ask you the question: has implementing data insights and data made the newsroom leadership harder or easier? And I think there's two parts of there where you say it's harder, but it's also easier to know your audience now and the direction you should be going.
Mm. Yeah, you're right. It's a bit of both. You know, it's definitely harder because you know you've got so much more information coming to you, but also that makes it easier as well to because you're getting real time analytics, you're getting historical analytics as well. But where it gets harder, I think, is also um, you know. uh, In the past, and this is why you know the leadership has to change. In the past, you only had one or two routes of direct communication with your audience. You had your newspaper sales numbers. If you had a website, you know, then in those early days, you got some data, and then you had letters to the editor and the occasional email. My goodness me, you know, it now comes through social media channels, you know, it comes through also, you know, newsletters, responses, engagement metrics, and that sort of thing. So, you know, it's really hard now for a leader to be on top of all that sort of thing. So, but you know, but also that also gives you a richness of feedback as well. So that's why I say it's a bit of both. You know, it makes your job harder as a leader because you're moving further and further away from being a journalist as an editor, which is what, you know, a really great editor was 20 years ago. You know, they just had to be a good journalist. But now you have to be so many other things and have so many other skills around you. But also, you know, you've then got that really great richness of information coming at you that enables you to make quick decisions. And as a leader, can I just carry on with this a
Yeah,
little bit?
absolutely.
One of the other things that I also find is that um, you've got to be able to pivot your decisions as well. So you may well say, okay, right, we're going in this direction and we're going to be doing these stories because this is really important. And if the data after a while is telling you that it's just not working, you've then got to be able to pivot and say, okay, right, we're going to move in this direction instead and follow this route and this strategy. And you as a leader have to bring the team with you. And, if I give you another example, I was working at a national paper last year in the sports team, and we moved away from page views and scale to driving subscriptions. And the editor was saying, well, last month we were talking about page views. Now you're saying we're not interested in page views anymore. And you as a leader have to interpret that and say, no, we are interested in it. But we're evolving our strategy and we're changing things because of these examples, going back to that difficult conversation again. These are the examples, these are the reasons why we need to change. And the leader then had to work hard to bring the team with them. And so the 10:45s, the 3 p.m. stand-ups in the newsrooms help to communicate the changes that you're doing, you're putting in place as a leader. So, not only having data and interpreting it, but then bringing your newsroom with you are all the leadership challenges which people just didn't have 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's also resonating in terms of thinking about the newsroom moving away from a lot of the known metrics having been used, page views and so other. That in Kilkaya we think align, adapt, achieve, which is then also that I think we're moving away more from like the standardized dashboards to then real dashboards that's fulfilling a strategy that the newsroom is going. And maybe data analytics is one of the strong ways of getting to a strategy that leadership is setting, and it needs to be customized. I think that's been a very good change in going forward. Let's go into sort of a conversation about then values and trust. And one of the things that you talked about, what I also see, is that pressure has never been sort of higher. There's deadlines, priorities, a lot more. Where do leadership values really show up here in the new world where a lot more pressure that we're seeing?
Yeah. I think every leader will have a different set of values. But I think there's some commonality between that as well. And, we've talked about this a little bit, but for me, I think one of the most important values that you need is to have empathy with the situation. We've talked about letting people go. And one of the, things that's really important as a leader to understand is that not only do you have to treat the people you're letting go with respect and making sure that, they are dealt with in a way which respects who they are and, those difficult situations. But also, it's really easy to forget that the people who are left behind, who remain in the office. Now, these are people who have lost their friends and their colleagues, people who they spend most of their working lives with, and so there's a grief element to that as well. We shouldn't underestimate that. That it does have a negative impact, and so you as a leader, needs to really recognise the fact that there are people who will have a feeling of loss. So it's not about just getting on and right, let's go and do the next thing because we've now restructured the business. You've got to really understand the impact that's had on your people. So empathy and emotional intelligence is really strong value. And then we go back to this idea of clarity as well. So that once you are talking to people, you need absolute clarity about this is the reason why we've made this decision, and this is where we're going next with it. So that's really key. And then the third thing that comes with it, and this is a theme throughout this conversation, Nils, isn't it? Is really good communication and having different methods for it. It's that to me is a bedrock of good leadership. If you lock yourself away in a room and you're not communicating with people, or you're just sending out an email and you think the job is done, then you're not providing the leadership which people are craving from you.
Why, in terms of the coming back to the pressure here again, is like, wouldn't all of that also sort of make it staying generally connected to the staff a lot more harder under that sort of pressure? Like, are you able to remain connected to the staff in those set of pressure?
Depends what we mean by connected, but I think it's a very hard now for a leader to have the close relationship with their staff that they want to have because of a number of things. If I think about it, the first thing is that we're in a results driven business, and never more relevant today is about, we talked about the data coming in, so we've got to deliver results, and we've got to deliver it really quickly. We've mentioned things like AI coming in, new technologies, all the pressures coming into the business, and so therefore, we are in a crisis. We're a crisis industry, and so delivering results is really important. And so therefore, from a leader, they're under an awful lot of pressure to deliver those results, and so therefore they need to drive the newsroom forward. And so that relentless necessity to drive the newsroom forward makes it difficult for you to stay connected to your team. So that's the first part, I guess. The second, I think, was you've also got to establish a bit of a gap between you as a leader and your team, because if you don't have that gap, then it's difficult to have those difficult conversations. It's difficult to be able to have those conversations with people that says, okay, well, look, we are going to have to pivot away from this, and you can't be down the pub drinking with them, in the night, and then the next day having a difficult conversation with them. That's really difficult. So to me, I think the difficulty in leadership is finding out how big that gap should be. There's got to be a gap. It can't be a chasm, because you need to stay connected, but trying to find what how big that gap is in terms of, you as a leader and these people being the people who work for you, is a real challenge for leadership. And then the third thing I would say is that, the leader is a sponge, right? And it's got to absorb an awful lot of information and a lot of things coming from the business. And, he doesn't want to be passing everything on to the team. So knowing what to cascade to the team, what to pass on to the team, what to keep themselves to themselves, and just take that burden. I used to have that a lot of the time when I was the editor-in-chief, a lot of stuff coming from the chief exec, which I wasn't going to share with the team. But you've still got to find a way of communicating to them the reason why you're changing your decisions and what you're doing. So I think they're the three real challenges in keeping that connection.
I keep on thinking about if you've probably seen the British The Office. I'm more a fan of the American one, but Michael Scott there says his leadership philosophy is, do I want my employees to fear me or love me? Actually, I want them to fear how much they love me. And I'm sitting there when I listen to this, I find this so hard, because I'm maybe a person that loves to get connected to everybody. I'm actually the one avoiding that difficult conversation, but maybe something I should get better at. But then, can I just ask?
We can do some coaching on that, Nils, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. But then, in terms of Jeremy, is leadership for everybody, or do you need to be a specific type to do these different things? Because, as you said, these conversations are never fun. But then, is leadership for everybody? Is one thing that comes to mind having this conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I don't think it is.
Can anybody be a good leader?
No, I don't think they can. I think you've got to want to explore yourself, and explore. I mean, look, I don't think I was a great leader, but what I've done in my time is I've learned more about what great leadership is. And I understand far more now about the whole idea about emotional intelligence, and having empathy and being able to understand people. I qualified as a coach, so that would help me to make sure I'm asking the right questions of people. And so you know I think as a person, if you want to be a good leader, then you can be. But if you not everyone can be a good leader if they're not prepared to do that self introspection and ask themselves. They've got to ask themselves difficult questions, and they've got to be prepared to change. And if you're not prepared to change, then I don't think you can be a good leader. So we go back to this idea, is the leadership model broken? Yes, it is, because we're still using, a lot of the time in newsrooms, the old way of leadership, because people haven't recognized the fact that they need to change with the Generation Z or Gen Z people coming through who've got different demands of you, and they want, there's different respect which they want. And, my days, you just tell people what to do and they did it. That doesn't work anymore.
And you started the conversation with this almost assessment that you do with people, knowing sort of where you are to then be able to, and it makes sense then, because then you have at least a starting point for maybe one of the things you want to improve on. But then I'm just curious, Jeremy, because talking through this, you for me, coaching people and then knowing these different things, you said you had this moment where you felt like you weren't a good leader. What made you feel like that? And what was your starting point what was it that you saw with your leadership that you had to change, if you want to share?
Yeah, well, I looking back is my assessment of me as a leader. Actually, when I was a leader, I thought, right, yeah, I'm doing quite a good job here. I'm doing the changes, etc. But when I've looked at the way that I did some of the things, I would have done it differently. And, one of the things that I'm aware of, that one of my points for development is the way I describe it, is that when under pressure, I used to become quite abrupt about things, and I used to, and that's how I used to manifest, the way that I was under pressure. And so therefore I didn't listen as much as I needed to. Reflecting back now, I now know when I'm under pressure and I know what the trigger point is. And so therefore, I recognize it, and then I force myself to go into listening mode and doing things differently. So I guess that, when I was under pressure, me as a leader became, okay, we're going in this direction, and I stopped listening as much as I should have done.
If somebody is listening so far to this conversation and feeling this is very interesting, and they might be an editor or a journalist struggling with their leadership around them, what would you want them to hear from you throughout your knowledge and working with newsroom leadership?
I would say, just appreciate that the leader who is trying to lead you and your team doesn't have all the answers. And, they're also in quite a lonely place. Being a leader is a lonely place to be. And so they don't have the people that they can rely on and talk to in the way that you possibly can with your network of people. And so to understand the fact that, they've got a lot of pressure that they're dealing with, and they may not have all the answers in this fast changing industry that we've got, and to give them space to make mistakes and to understand that is possibly the greatest gift you could give a leader.
And if we turn it around, if one of the listeners now is in a leadership role, what is one thing they could be doing different tomorrow?
I think on that one is this theme which we've talked about during this conversation, and that is, it's okay not to have all the answers.
Mm.
And don't expect yourself to have all the answers in the way that our industry has changed over the last 10, 15 years. It's okay not to know all the answers. And it's also, okay to find the people and build a team around you who know more about it than you do.
Jeremy, we have a closing tradition on this podcast where the previous guest gets to leave a question for the next one. The previous guest that I had on the podcast was Christoph Schmitz. He is a product manager at Schibsted who developed Curate. It's a content personalization tool, which enables personalization really high up on the homepage. And he is having a question related to working with the newsroom and then implementing one of the new tools for them, where basically most people see different homepages with content. And he is asking, how can you visualize a personalized homepage for the newsroom in a way that gives editors transparency and confidence? And I think that's more in terms of confidence to how the algorithm works and so on. It's a very specific question, but it's also implementing something new for the newsroom, which I know is big and goes into even leadership doing it? Like, do you have an answer to Christoph?
Thanks, Christoph. That's a great question. Um, Look, I don't know about personalization. That's not my skill level and skill area. But
And
you
it's
know, each,
allowed to not have all the answers.
yeah, exactly,
Mm.
correct. So which is where I'm going to on that. So, but what my skill area is about how to introduce change and new things, whether that's AI or user needs or personalization. And so, what I would do is I would get the relevant people into a room. And I would share examples to demonstrate it. So if you go back to, so this framework I have for having difficult conversations, you can adapt to, quite a lot of scenarios. And so, as a leader of change, wanting to put in this new homepage and the personalization, I would make it clear at the outset about this is what we're going to be talking about today and over the coming days about personalization. And this is the reason why we need to change it. And then I would demonstrate that says, okay, Nils, these are your interest areas, and this is what your homepage would look like. Jeremy, we know that you're interested in these health topics, these sporting things. They're different from Nils. Nils is mad. He does extreme sports and you don't. And so therefore, these are the stories which are served on his page and these are the stories that are served on yours. And then I would get each of the people to put Post-its in the room to say, okay, these are my interest areas. And then I would then show that on how their personalized homepage changes. And then and then I would then I would go to the data and say, right, and these are how these individual stories are performing. And so you're going through this process of like you're setting your outcome, your objective, you're opening, the conversation. You're then providing examples of the data and how things will change depending on who you are. And then I would have a discussion within the room about, okay, right, now knowing what we know, what are the changes that we need to make to the way that we're operating and identifying the stories for personalization and for the homepage and get them to contribute those ideas and get them to buy into it. And then I would say, right, okay, having got all that, what are our next actions? What do we need to do next? Let's come back to it next week, having thought about it and what we need to do. So that's how I would, as a leader, bring in change. That's how I would demonstrate, the reasons why we're doing it and how it works, and then what their part in it is. Because if it's all top down, this is what we're going to do, guys. Just go off and do it.
Mm.
It just isn't going to work. If you're having a two-way conversation, not a broadcast, and you're getting them to input and participate into it, you're going to get their buy-in to that process of change.
It's interesting seeing almost how you use the 6-step process of doing it, and it's something that can be replicated on so many different ways. And Jeremy, you must also have been burning in on some questions, and we get some really, really fantastic people on this podcast. What's a burning question that you have that you would want to ask the next guest, not knowing who that person is or what they do?
Okay. My question is going to be based around leadership. And I'm going to say that given the changes that are taking place in newsrooms, how does a leader need to change the way that they lead their teams in such a way that they bring the whole of the team with them and embrace the next wave of technology coming to their newsroom?
Fantastic. I'm going to make sure to bring that forward. Jeremy, I want to thank you so much for doing this. And I learned a lot, and I think the listeners are going to be. And it's so fantastic to see like how you can have a framework stepwise in this. And I really, really appreciate you taking time to join the podcast.
Oh, thank you. I think the questions have been great. They've really made me think as well. And just to reinforce and actually change some of my thinking and my approaches, I think. So having someone ask those questions of you helps with your own self-development. So thanks. I had great fun. Great to see you, Nils.
Appreciate it. So hold up for just 1 second. I just want to say thank you for listening throughout the whole episode. Right now you can see I'm editing the video. And one thing that I would really love is that if you subscribe to the channel, to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts, to YouTube, so you can follow all of the different episodes. It really matters. because we see that people that are signed up really listens more. And if you would do me the favor, if you haven't subscribed and do that, I'll make sure to make even better videos, even better content. I'm looking to speak with more people. Thank you very much.